targeted under these kind of derogatory and inflammatory remarks made back and forth of each other. If you think about like Donald Trump calling Hillary Clinton a nasty woman or whatever, this is where this stuff starts, is in the election of 1828. And remember, Adams and Jackson already have this bad mojo history, right? They've already got kind of this negative past because of the election of 1824. Adams on his, like, from the Adams side, the anti-Adams people accused and brought up issues with Adams, talked about his gambling problem. In fact, they even brought up the fact that, oh, scandalous here, that he brought a billiards table into the White House. Which, yeah, today we're like, okay, so what? But, like, at the time, I mean, it's a gambling, right? And it's a sin, and so, therefore, wrong, you shouldn't have the pool table in the White House, right? The other things that they bring up is they accuse Adams of hiring a servant girl while visiting the Russian ambassador to spend some time with said servant girl, and that he liked to frequent prostitutes. They also, so, and that kind of is some of the worst of what they bring up for Adams. On the other side, the Adams camp brings up a whole lot of negative stuff about Jackson. They talk about and say that Jackson is illiterate. They call him an adulterer and a bigamist. And the reason why they call him a bigamist is because of the fact that Jackson's wife, Rachel Robards, she was actually still married when they got married. She was married to her first husband. He had abandoned her and just really, like, had basically just pushed her out. He was also very abusive. I mean, her first husband was not a nice dude. But you have to understand, divorces back then were much more difficult than a divorce today. And also just the legal proceeding took a lot longer because, like, if it was a case of abandonment, you had to wait a certain period of time before, as a female, you could basically say, he's left me, and so therefore I should be able to move on and remarry. So she's technically still married, but I mean, she has, like, nothing to do with her husband. It's not like they're having an affair, but they still throw him and her also under the bus in this. And so, unfortunately, it just kind of how that worked out. They also, we'll talk about Jackson being like a philanderer, and they bring up, of course, the fact that Jackson gets involved in numerous duels, right? And so they say that he's hot-headed and unfit for the office of the presidency, and some other, bring up some other things. And it gets so bad that Jackson actually sent his wife, Rachel, away from Washington, D.C. He sends her back home to Tennessee and tells the people that she's staying with and those people looking after her, her servants, etc., to make sure that she doesn't get a hold of any newspapers, because he's really worried about the effect that this might have on his wife. She's pretty kind of soft-hearted, kind-hearted woman. And unfortunately, Rachel manages to get a hold of a newspaper somehow. They're not really sure how it happens, if she just, there was a newspaper out, she just kind of stumbled across it or what, or somebody planted it there. She stumbles across this newspaper, and the whole newspaper is really slamming her, not even so much slamming Jackson, but really bringing her out as, and basically calling her a whore and a prostitute and all these things, because she was still married when she married Jackson. And she has a heart attack and dies.
From that?
From that. Right now, she's probably had some other health problems going on in that, but, you know, at the time, they say basically that she died of a broken heart, right? That she was so traumatized by this that she dies of a heart attack, and Jackson is crushed. He loves his wife. He loves his wife more than most anything, right? As a man should, and he hates Adams for it. He blames Adams directly for the death of his wife.
He challenged him to a duel?
He does not challenge him to a duel. What's that? Yeah, Jackson probably would have just, like, killed him. But it's largely because of a lot of that mudslinging that's going back and forth. And also, in part because of the very negative effect it has on Rachel, that the American public opinion swings much more towards Jackson than it does towards Adams. And so, and also the fact Adams during his first presidency really doesn't accomplish a whole lot, and so they're looking for some sort of a change. So that, as well as population shifts, which there are going to be more people living in the western portion of the United States than western portion of the United States, okay? Keep in context, we're talking about this part of the United States being western United States right now, okay? But there are more people living in western United States, and as a result of that, there is a greater push or greater force of the common norm, you know, everyday person outside of Virginia, outside of the East Coast, because you're going to see more electoral votes coming from this region out here. And that begins to change and shift, which is part of the reason why we will see for the first time ever a non-Virginian elected to the office of the presidency, as Jackson is from Tennessee. But Jackson clearly gets the needed electoral votes for this particular election and thus is victorious. He will go on after he goes into the White House and takes office. He will create basically like a shrine to his wife, to his deceased wife, and there's like monument for her there in Tennessee, where she is buried. So what ensues after the election of Jackson is sometimes called, or what it begins after the election of Jackson is clearly the end of what we call the era of good feelings. Previous to that, Jefferson to Adams, we have this time period where everything is kind of okay, the economy's kind of okay, politically things are kind of stable, and so everybody's like, oh, it's the era of good feelings. But there's a lot of things going on in the background that also are leading to increased tensions in the United States. Does that make sense? And Jackson becomes a very clear representation of that. There's also going to be a change that happens in the election of 1828 that will change things as well, that also leads us to where we don't wind up with 4 different people running for the office of the presidency. When we initially create our electoral process, how we picked who would be running for the office of the presidency was originally through a small caucus, okay? So, in other words, a few people from the political party would select, this is going to be the dude that runs for president. So, as citizens of the United States, you had a very limited choice of who you would vote for. Does that make sense? The Founding Fathers believed that this protected the office of the presidency and protected the United States government and our democracy from an uneducated voting electorate, right? So control that who actually has a lot of say. But as our country expands and under Jackson, there is a greater call for more direct democracy. As much as Jefferson extends democracy to more individuals, he only does that through property ownership, right? He buys Louisiana so that more people can own property, so more people can qualify to vote. Jackson, on the other hand, believes that instead we need to extend that democratic rights to more Americans, I'm sorry, I should say more white male Americans, okay, by eliminating property qualifications and also by opening up the system a little bit in the electoral process. So what we see happen under Jackson is the creation of the convention, on which rather than having a small caucus pick members of 2 people or a few people to run for office, the larger convention gets more people in that pool to pick who's going to run for office. Does that make sense? There is no direct primary yet, though. The direct primary doesn't come about until the 19-teens. Does that make sense? Okay? It's part of the progressive era legislational change. Okay? So where now, if you are a registered Republican, you can vote for the different candidates and then select who's going to be your primary candidate, like Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton if you were a Democrat.
Okay, so you have to register to like vote, to like, you have to register to a party?
It depends on the particular state, but in order to vote in the primary, you have to be registered with the particular party. Does that make sense? So if you're a Democratic voter, like if you're registered as a Democrat, you cannot vote in the Republican primary.
So you can't vote in the primary in general?
No, you can vote in the primary, but you have to vote for your party in the primary. Like, okay, so I'm an independent voter, right? I don't vote strictly Republican or strictly Democrat. So I can't actually vote in a primary election because I'm not registered Democratic or Republican.
Do they have that?
That sounds really stupid.
Do they have that file? Like, so you can pull up Johnson.
Yeah.
So wait, if you like,
What are so the primary elections like before the main election? Do they have that in North Dakota where you can go vote in primary?
It's everywhere. There's primary elections in every state. That's how we wound up with Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton as our candidates for the office of presidency. That's what the primary is for. Does that make sense? To pick a candidate. Okay, that's what it's for, is to pick the candidate. So that's why if you are a registered Democrat, you can't vote in the Republican primary, because then you could be like, well, I know this person's not going to be able to beat my candidate, so I'm going to vote and make sure this person, does that make sense? And it would cause a flaw or an error.
Okay, so primaries are used to determine candidates.
Yes.
Which are from like multiple candidates that are nominated,
Yes,
right?
yes.
How are they nominated?
Well, they can be nominated by the party itself, by the Republican Party, or they can just say, I am going to run for president of the United States of America under the Republican ticket in 20 whatever.
Then why don't they just cut out
2020.
the middleman and have, because then it'd be like multiple people running and then there wouldn't be like, what happens?
So why not eliminate the primary and just have everybody vote for everybody that wants to run? Okay? It's a possibility, and that could be something that we wind up seeing like change. But the problem that we've seen when we've had more than 2 primary candidates running for office, it's divided the vote, and then potentially we'll have run into problems where, like for example, with Adams and Jackson in 1824, it goes to the House of Representatives, and the person with actually the most electoral votes did not win the presidency. Does that make sense? Or we wind up in a situation like with the Lincoln election in 1860, where we had 4 people who again split the vote, and Lincoln winds up becoming president of the United States with his name not even appearing on the ballot in the South.
Wow.
And then we split. Does that make sense? So there's a potential problem if you have that. You could also have the problem where with the Electoral College, you may not have one person who gets the necessary required number of electoral votes. Does that make sense? So, and people argue, well, we should just eliminate the Electoral College. But as North Dakotans, you actually really benefit from the Electoral College. Because your state's smaller, so your individual vote has a higher percentage weight than like somebody in California, even though they have more electoral votes. Does that make sense? So,
California, like if we had an electoral college, like California, New York would like pretty much pick
well,
the
and that too, yeah. If we did not have an electoral college, the big states like California would pretty much decide who would be our president. So we would pretty much always have a Democratic.
yeah, why is it winner takes all with the electoral vote? Like, oh, if it's this 3.
It doesn't have to be. The electors, and depending on the state, they can decide how they want to split the electors. Does that make sense, or how they want to split the votes? Generally speaking, yes, but technically the electors are members of, so like in North Dakota, it went Republican, right? The majority vote goes Republican in North Dakota. Pretty much always does. There's a few years in there where we don't vote Republican, but otherwise we pretty much always vote Republican, okay? So in North Dakota, because of that, what could happen though is those electors are actually members of the Republican Party. Does that make sense? And they're just people that are nominated to go and like cast that ballot. They're typically people that have worked for the Republican campaign in the state of North Dakota. They can, if they want to, they can switch their vote. They do not have to vote
for what the people want.
For what the people actually want.
So,
In some states, not in all states, in some states they are bound to vote based on what the voters wanted, but not in all states. Does that make sense?
So people vote for the person to vote for them.
Yes.
What about our state?
In North Dakota, I believe in North Dakota, don't
Bound.
quote me on this, but I think in North Dakota they are not bound.
They're not bound.
So they could, if they decided, I'm not going to vote for Donald Trump even though
Majority.
I'm a Republican and he was majority win because it's Donald Trump and I don't agree with that, I'm going to go vote for whoever, they could technically, but it didn't happen. It pretty much is
Well,
political
I mean-
suicide, yes.
I
Because
mean-
these people, the reason why they're working for the Republican campaign or the Democratic campaign is because they have political aspirations of their own. Does that make sense? So yes, it would amount to political suicide.
Unless it's like something like the person's definitely crazy.
Well,
But that never happened.
Didn't really happen this last.
yeah, so,
How much crazier can you get?
Well, I mean like really crazy, like
yeah.
traitors.
We elect people into the college, right?
No, we do not elect people into the Electoral College. They are
I
nominated
don't want any
members
crazy-
of the party, of the
I
Republican
think
Party.
Roger thought it was elected, Jamal.
They are, it's not like our Congress member or state Congress members or anything. They are just picked people from the Republican Party in the state of North Dakota.
That's pretty good comment, right?
So like if you were registered Republican and you worked for the Republican campaign for the president in North Dakota, you could potentially be the elector that's assigned to go and vote. Does that make sense?
I think Froz's brother Jamal was one of the electors.
Okay, maybe, I don't know.
He's like best friends with John Halpern.
Okay.
That's good.
I don't know, you'd have to ask. All right,
Jamal.
so, we now have that direct primary though, but does that make sense? Okay, so Jackson enters into office. In his inaugural promise, he promises to give more power to the states, to replace the unfaithful government officers, and to put in place people who are actually qualified for the job. This does not happen, but that's his promise. And he also promises to clear the national debt. This is the tomb then that he erects for his wife. Jackson is also buried there with his wife as well. Jackson believes that he needs to eliminate all those property qualifications, and so as that common man president in his inaugural, it is a huge, huge spectacle. In fact, it is the first time that the president's inaugural address has a very large attendance by the regular public. There are thousands of people who will travel to Washington, D.C. to witness their common man be inaugurated into the office of the presidency. Jackson firmly believes in this idea of a rotation in office. Again, this is one of the reasons why Trump likes to pair himself with Jackson. Because at the time, Jackson would have called it, if we were to put it in today's terminology, draining the swamp, right? That people should not remain in office forever, because if they do, they wind up not actually fulfilling the jobs that they should do. However, despite his ideas and belief in rotation in office and his ideas of what he called turnabout is fair play, he also allows a lot of people to criticize him pretty heavily, and he also has a tendency to put people in place who worked for him, and so this becomes known as the spoils system. Martin Van Buren was one of these individuals who had helped Jackson to get elected, and so as a result, Martin Van Buren becomes Jackson's Secretary of State. As Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren is largely kind of held responsible for a lot of Jackson's economic decisions, and so that's part of the reason why, as president, he's sometimes referred to as Martin Van Ruin instead of Martin Van Buren. Okay? But Jackson wants kind of this clean sweep, but doesn't get it. Oftentimes, he had a tendency to fill posts with his friends and other political supporters. Many of these individuals were unfit for their job. Sometimes we call Jackson's cabinet his kitchen cabinet, because he creates body of 13 temporary advisors that do not whatsoever at all have to answer to Congress. And then he kind of rotated these individuals in and out as he wanted. This is not unconstitutional to create a cabinet system. In fact, the precedent for creating a cabinet system is put in place under Washington. There's nothing in the Constitution that allows for the president to create a cabinet. Does that make sense? So this idea of him creating an advisory board is not that out of the ordinary. But while he is in office, he will remove one out of every 10 executive appointees. So he really likes to change things up frequently. Part of that also is the fact that Jackson just is a very difficult dude to work with, and is very argumentative. And so oftentimes he would appoint somebody because they were one of his friends, one of his cronies. They thought like him, and then the person would have some sort of disagreement with Jackson. They would have a falling out, and Jackson would say,
Goodbye, you're fired.
"You're fired, goodbye," right? But you're fired in the words of Donald Trump, right? And again, this is a lot of why Donald Trump kind of associates himself as like Jackson. He's a political outsider. Jackson was a political outsider. The idea of creating and putting the best people for the job in the positions is what they say they do. I would strongly disagree that Donald Trump has put the best people in the job positions for the job. I mean, I don't know how you run a public education system when you have no knowledge of public education whatsoever at all. But beyond that, question. It's not just Betsy DeVos that's lost. There's a lot of people that are lost. But anyways.
On the job.
Yeah.
So the cabinet is not like, I thought that was like all like the Secretary of State, Department of Defense, like Homeland
Yes.
Security.
Yeah, but then he creates a secondary cabinet. That's his kitchen cabinet. Does that make sense? And these were just 10 very close advisors that would tell him what to do.
So the cabinet is like all like the department.
Yes. But there's nothing in the Constitution that creates that cabinet.
Not
Does that make
one,
sense?
Or
The other one. Neither one. Not the regular cabinet with the secretary of blah, 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 right? Or the kitchen cabinet that Jackson creates, this group of personal advisors.
And now every president afterwards have had both.
Generally speaking, yes, they have both.
They at least have the one, though.
Yeah. They always have the secretaries, right? But then sometimes they also have like their own personal advisory group. Donald Trump has a personal advisory group too.
It's all weird numbers.
Okay, so, but when we look at that, Jackson has a tendency to rotate those people out very quickly. So does Donald Trump. There are other things, though, that I would strongly disagree with about them being the same. One, the idea that Jackson is a common man. Jackson is somebody who grew up out of poverty, right, and has created, and everything that Jackson was because of his own hard work and work ethic. I would not agree that Donald Trump has been able to do the same. I mean, when you talk about getting a small loan of $1 million, I would not call that a small loan.
They don't even ask for that on Shark Tank.
Yeah.
But you look at what he did with that money.
Well, but he also
What's that? Yes and no. Yes, he does, but because of his political and economic decisions, we go into a panic immediately following the presidency of Jackson. What you have to understand is that most financial panics the causes don't occur in that presidency. They occur in previous presidencies. So like we blame Hoover for the Great Depression. Hoover is not responsible for the Great Depression nor the policies that caused the Great Depression. In fact, Calvin Coolidge and even Warren G. Harding are more responsible for the economic policies that caused that panic. Sometimes George W. Bush is blamed for the most recent financial panic, and it's actually the policies of his dad and Clinton that led to that financial panic, not Bush's policies. Does that make sense? So things don't happen that quickly. It takes time for the effects of those sorts of things to work out. And quite frankly, although Jackson does help to pay off the national debt, he does so at the detriment of our national economy. Does that make sense? Outside of his presidency, but it is still at the detriment of the national economy. Does that make sense? Okay, so the other thing that Jackson is largely known for, or also kind of really shows Jackson's character, is Indian removal and the subsequent Indian Removal Act. Jackson believes the American Indians are uncivilized. He gains a lot of this ideas from the time in which he is down in Florida and stationed in this region and in Georgia, and is fighting against the Seminoles in the Florida, and he actually believed that the Seminole people needed to be wiped out entirely. And so he truly believes that the American Indian people should just be moved and be moved out of contact with whites, right? So what happens then in the American South is, as we have continued to expand cotton and cotton production, land in this region is becoming more and more sought after and more desirable. And some of that land in particular lies within Georgia, okay? Now, there are individuals who live within this region, though, including, in particular in Georgia, the Cherokee people. Now, the Cherokee tribe, much like the other 5 civilized tribes, which included the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Seminole, Cherokee, and Creek, okay, sorry, I had to think of them, they're all C's except for one, okay, these individuals had pretty much adopted a lot of the white ways. They had very much assimilated into much more Anglican or American culture. They were farmers predominantly. They wore clothing that was very atypical of an American during the time. On occasion, they might wear, like men in particular would wear a little bit more traditional, like necklaces or jewelry, but otherwise they very much looked like any average white dude. Does that make sense? Or a white woman. They wore the same accoutrement or the same clothing. That didn't matter to Jackson. Jackson still saw them as uncivilized people, as lesser people. This is where I would say, again, this is a point where Donald Trump and Jackson are potentially similar here, is in their perception of people that are outside of their own group here, okay? But they see them as very much uncivilized, and so what ensues in the state of Georgia is that the Cherokee within Georgia are being pushed off of their land. They argue that this is land that they own, and it's actually land that has been gifted to them via treaties that were made earlier on with the Cherokee tribe and the U.S. government. So in 1831, the Cherokee will bring the first suit to the federal government, Cherokee Nation versus Georgia. And in that case, the suit basically, Marshall says, we can't actually hear on this because the Cherokee Nation is not like entirely a foreign entity in and of its own. There is a trust relationship between the United States and the tribe, but the tribe cannot sue the state of Georgia. An individual tribal member could sue the state of Georgia for violation of this land contract, but the tribe itself cannot sue the state of Georgia. Does that make sense? So Marshall basically says we can't really even hear this case. It goes back the next year, 1832, back to the Supreme Court in Worcester v. Georgia. Okay, so this is a secondary part of this. And in that case, they say that the state of Georgia, now it's an individual suing, right? The state of Georgia has no claim to the American Indian lands, and they are in violation of these treaties, and so therefore this land belongs to the American Indians, the Cherokee people. Georgia, you can't have this land. Okay? Now, this is much to the frustration or whatever you want to say, of Jackson. Because in 1830, Jackson has already passed legislation called the Indian Removal Act, in which those 5 civilized tribes would be removed from the American South and be moved into what will be called Indian Territory. They'll be moved into Oklahoma. Forget about the panhandle of Oklahoma because it's not there. But Indian Territory will be basically Indian Territory, okay, roughly. And this will be land then that is forever given to the American Indians. Does that make sense? So this law has been passed. The Supreme Court has basically said the law is void because the Cherokee Nation cannot take the land, or the state of Georgia cannot take the land from the American Indians and evict them.
With nowhere to go.
So, Indian Removal Act, constitutional or unconstitutional?
Unconstitutional.
Unconstitutional, because the land cannot be taken by Georgia, right? Now, it's Andrew Jackson, though, and Andrew Jackson could give a rat's about what the Marshall Court says. And so Andrew Jackson says, fine, I'm simply just not going to enforce the Supreme Court decision, nor am I going to back it up, and in fact, I'm going to go directly against the Supreme Court decision, and he sends in the U.S. military in order to forcibly remove 100,000 individuals from the 5 civilized tribes into Indian Territory. Oh, I forgot, it goes up a little bit higher in there too. So we actually wind up removing from the south the Seminole, the Creek, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, all are moved into this region here, and then the Sac and the Fox wind up getting moved up in here. But this is later Indian Territory that is created. Does that make sense? Or later, a little bit later being moved. They're all forced then to move along different pathways, but the one we're most predominantly aware of is the Cherokee movement along the Trail of Tears. And that's really the one that kind of sparks the most frustration and hatred. Part of that is also because of the fact that some of these tribes, like for example the Seminole tribe in Florida, was already pretty well decimated in population by the time that they were forcibly moved. So there's not as large a population in the Seminole tribe or even in the Creek tribe as there is in the Cherokee tribe. But they're all forced to move. It will also in Florida lead to a second Seminole War against the U.S. government as the Seminoles try to fight back and to prevent that removal that will last from 1835 to 1842. In order for the movement, when it comes to the Cherokee people were actually given 2 years to do it on their own, but they believed that they shouldn't have to move, right? The Supreme Court told them that you don't have to. They actually did everything that they were supposed to, right? The Constitution, how do you fight a law that is illegal or unconstitutional? You appeal it to the Supreme Court, right? And so that becomes your methodology of challenging those cases. So these individuals, they did and they worked through the system the way that they were supposed to, only to still be told to get out and to move out. And so ultimately, the United States government will use that treaty to move almost all of the 17,000 Cherokees out of there. And when we look at the Trail of Tears itself, this is actually an image that comes out later, much later, about 40 years after the Trail of Tears, if I remember correctly. But we can look at individuals and their documentation of the Trail of Tears, and also looking at from both perspectives. So this perspective actually comes from Lieutenant L.B. Webster, so a lieutenant on the U.S. military. He has been assigned to remove the Cherokee Nation, and we see in what he's talking about in here that it was pitiful to behold the women and children who suffered exceedingly as they were all obliged to walk, with the exception of the sick. He goes on later to talk about that, he says, and I have always looked upon with awe, lest their prayers which I have felt ascending to heaven and calling for justice to him, who can alone will grant it, might fall upon my guilty head as one of the instruments of oppression. So he himself recognizes the problem with him forcing the Cherokee to be removed from this land and the kind of fallacy that exists within that. What we also need to understand about the Cherokee people, which kind of helps pushes that idea of them being civilized and also against these people being uncivilized, is the fact that the Cherokee people had already much earlier converted to Christianity. So they were practicing Christians, and so here you have these individuals are praying to God, they speak English, they look like you. It becomes increasingly difficult for the soldiers to move them, but they were required to do so. They were given their orders, and so for Webster, he was following orders, but he also knows that he's wrong in following these orders. So it's an interesting dichotomy, because if you look at later comparisons with, like, say, for example, the Holocaust, and you look at the Nuremberg trials, a lot of those individuals who were brought up on trial simply said, well, I was following orders. I was following orders. I was following orders. Well, Webster says, well, yeah, I was following orders, but this is so wrong. Does that make sense? And so there's a clear difference there than in the taking of personal responsibility for what is being done. And he actually basically says, like, that I should be punished for this, and I hope God punishes me for this, which is quite interesting for that time frame. This comes from a survivor. Although they did speak English, their English was limited. It was not nearly as well spoken as some of the others. But it says, long time we travel on way to new land. People feel bad when they leave old nation. Women cry and make sad wails. Children cry and many men cry. And all look sad like when friends die. But they say nothing and just put heads down and keep on going towards west. Many days pass and people die very much. But we bury close by the trail. So sometimes they were able to bury their dead, not always, due to the restrictions and trying to move them quickly, and also the weather and the time of year in which they were moving. Sometimes the soil was too hard to actually break the ground and to be able to bury their dead. So unfortunately, sometimes they were just left out to die as they moved along. The Trail of Tears ultimately becomes one of those moments in American history that is really kind of a black spot on American history. And ultimately, although Oregon Territory was supposed to be reserved for the American Indian people for prosperity and to remain Indian Territory for all time, as per the Indian Removal Act of 1830, it ultimately is taken from the American Indians as part of westward expansion.
Oregon's a long ways from where we live.
What?
Oregon's far.
Yeah.
It's a long walk.